Hello everyone, Alex here from WarrenOffKeys.com, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can update channel permissions within Discord using the Discord.js library. Now real quick before we start, if you do need help with anything, feel free to ask in the WarrenOffKeys Discord server. A link to that will be in the pinned comments as well as in the video description. Also, access to the GitHub repository can also be found within the Discord server, and so you can actually clone this project right here and you can code along with me. So with that said, let's get started. Within this project, I am using the Commando framework, and a link to a video on how to use the Commando framework will be found in the video description. But if you have a different command system, feel free to use that. So I'm going to go inside of my commands folder and inside of my MISC folder, and I'm going to make a new file. This one is going to be called update-permissions.js. Now this file is going to export a command class, or something that extends the command class rather. And so in order to do that, we have to have access to the command class, and that means we need access to Commando. So I'm first going to create a Commando object, and this is going to set equal to require discord.js-commando, and then we're going to export a class, so module.exports equals class. This will be called update permissions command, and this class is going to extend or inherit the functionality of commando.command, which is a different class that gives us base functionality out of the box to be able to create commands effectively. So I can say extends, and then I can specify the class we want to extend, which is commando.command. Now at this stage, we can add in our curly braces, and then we can create a constructor function. This will be ran whenever a new instance of this class is created. And we're going to have one parameter here, which is our client. And within here, we have to call the constructor function for the actual command class. And in order to call the constructor function for a class you're extending, you have to call the super function. Now this is going to take in two arguments. The first one is the client, which we already have access to due to our constructor arguments. The second one is going to be an object that'll specify some information on the command. For example, the name is going to be update permissions. The group is going to be MISC because we are inside of the MISC folder over here on the left. We can then say member name, which will also be update permissions. We can have a description, which you can add in whatever you want. I'm just going to simply say updates a channel's permissions. Now we don't want anyone to be able to access this, so we have to specify user permissions, which is going to make sure that whoever's running the command has access to certain permissions. In this case, I'm going to use administrator, but you can add in whatever permission nodes you want right here. Now within the class and outside of the constructor, we need an asynchronous run function. So I can say run equals async, and this function is what will be ran whenever someone actually types in the command. So we're going to have a few different options here. The first one is going to be the message, and the second one is going to be the arguments. Now by default with Commando, the arguments are going to be an entire single string. And so every single thing you add, whether there's a space or not, is going to be sent as one single string. We want to have an array of strings so we can actually gain access to each piece of information we need to perform this functionality. A simple way to do that is inside of the options here, we can say args type, and we can set that to multiple as a string. Now args is going to be an array instead of just a single string. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the correct number of arguments was provided, so we have access to all the pieces of information that we want. The easiest way to do this is to check the length of the array. And as an example, we are going to have a syntax similar to update permissions. And then we are going to have the channel ID and then the role ID to update the permissions for. And then we're going to have a string. This is either going to be add or remove. It must be one of those two. Capitalization won't matter. And then the last one is going to be any amount of permission nodes. So a permission node is going to be something like this. It's going to be an actual string that represents a specific permission, and these have to be spelled a very specific way. If we go over to the Discord.js documentation, and a link to this exact page will be in the description, we can see all of the possible permission nodes right here. So we see administrator, which is what we're using to check the user permissions for the actual command. Going back, we also see view channel right here. And this is one of the two permission nodes I'm going to use as an example. The other example is going to be attached files. You can add in as many or remove as many permission nodes for each individual role that you want. So it's completely up to you. I'm just going to show you the concepts here. So I'm going to minimize this. We might go back to it soon, but this is going to be the syntax. And for example, if someone wanted to add multiple, they can just separate them with spaces, just like additional arguments. So basically these 3 specific arguments are going to be required to be specific values for the channel ID, role ID, and then the action we want to take. And then every argument past that, whether it's 1 or 50 of them, is going to be the exact permissions that we want to either add or remove to the target channel for the target role. If that doesn't make sense, then just keep watching, keep coding along with me, and I'm sure you'll understand it by the end of the video. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure we have at least 4 arguments, because we have 1 here, 2 here, 3 here, and then 4. So there has to be at least 1 permission node, so we have a minimum of 4 arguments here. So I can say if args.length is less than 4, at this point, we can then complain to the user, telling them the correct syntax. So I can say message.reply, and then we're going to use a template literal here to be able to type in certain strings and insert in certain values into the string. So this message could say something like, you must provide a channel ID, role ID, an action, and some number of permission nodes. And because we're using template literals, we can make this a multi-line message. We can provide a syntax example. So we can say syntax example here. Now at this point, we want to actually specify a realistic example. And because Commando has the ability to change the command prefix for each individual server or guild that your bot is in, we want to specify the actual prefix that the guild is going to be using for the message that's being sent in right now. So for example, if someone ran this command in a server that had a exclamation point as a prefix, then we want to specify the exclamation point. If they have a question mark, then we want to specify the question mark, and so this might change depending on each guild. So with that said, let's gain access to the guild. We can simply destructure it, so const guild equals message, and now we have access to the guild. And this guild object as well as this message object aren't the typical guild and message objects you see with the default Discord.js library. Because this is using Commando, these are special objects that are going to have additional functionality, such as the ability to view the command prefix for the exact guild that we're referencing here. So in order to access that, we can say guild.command prefix. And then directly after that, we want to specify the name of our command. So instead of me typing update permissions for a 3rd time, I'm actually going to make a string here. So I'm going to double click and use Control-C to copy, or Command-C on Mac. And then I'm going to create a constant up here called name. And I'm going to set that equal to update permissions. I can then set that as the value for name. And then also here, we can specify name. So now the name and the member name are going to be the same thing as update permissions right up here. And so down here, we've referenced the command prefix, in my case as an exclamation point. Directly afterwards, without a space, we want to specify the name of the command. So we're going to reference the name variable, which we just created. And then we want to specify the rest of the arguments. So we can say channel ID, role ID, and then a string of add or remove, and then also any amount of permission nodes. Now, if someone is using your bot and they don't necessarily know what a permission node is or what options are, we might want to provide an example or a reference. So on a few more lines down, I'm going to say a list of valid permission nodes can be found here. And then I'm going to paste in the URL that is referencing the documentation page. And if you didn't know, you can actually surround a URL with less than and greater than signs to prevent the embed from actually showing up. So I'm going to do that here. And that means that whenever this is pasted, the actual embed or the preview of the Discord documentations will not actually be displayed. So now after this, we want to make sure that we return, because at this stage, there is incorrect syntax. And so we don't actually want to run the code because we don't have all the information, because whoever ran the command did not run it correctly. So we want to make sure that we return within this if statement to make sure that we don't continue with the rest of our code. Now after this, we want to verify that the channel ID is valid, the role ID is valid, the action is either add or remove. We don't care about the case, and I'll show you how to do that soon. And then after all of that information is validated, we then want to actually perform the change to the actual channel depending on the permission nodes. So let's start off with the channel. We have access to the channel ID as the first argument. And in JavaScript, arrays have a function called shift, which will remove the first element of an array and then return that. So if I wanted to access channel ID, I can say const channel ID and set this equal to args.shift. So what's happening here is it is going to set the value of channel ID equal to whatever the first argument is, but also remove that argument from our array. The goal is to do this for these three things right here, the channel ID, role ID, and the action. That way we are just left with an array of permission nodes that we can then loop through and apply those to the channel. So I'm going to add in a comment here that'll say get the channel ID and remove it from the array. So we have this, the channel ID is no longer in the array, and now we want to make sure that that channel actually exists. So I can create a constant called channel and set this equal to guild.channels.cache.get. We can pass in the channel ID. This is going to return a falsy value if it couldn't find it. So if not channel, we could then complain to the user. So message.reply, and we can say something like unknown channel, and then we can return. Now after that, we want to make sure that the role actually exists. So I can say get the role ID and remove it from the array. So I can say const role ID equals args.shift, because at this point, the first element is now the role ID, because the first element up here, line 36, was actually removed and returned to the channel ID variable. So now we want to make sure we have access to the actual role. So I can say const role equals guild.roles.cache.get, pass in the role ID. And then at this point, I can say if not role, we want to also complain to the user. So message.reply, unknown role, and then we can return. Now we need to verify that the action is either the word add or the word remove. So I can say constant action equals args.shift dot to lowercase. Because we want to make sure that capitalization doesn't matter, we need to convert the user's input to lowercase and compare that to a lowercase string. We can't always control what the user has, so we want to make sure that that is lowercase, but we can control what we type, and so we can compare those to lowercase strings. So I'm going to add in another comment here that'll say get the action and make sure it is either add or remove. So now here I can say if action is not exactly equal to add and action is not exactly equal to remove, we can then complain to the user because they entered something else. Now it's important that these are lowercase here because the user input is being converted to lowercase, and so for proper comparison, both things need to be either uppercase or lowercase. So here I can then reply with please provide either add or remove as an action, and then I can return. Now at this stage, because we've been using the shift method, our argument array now only contains our permission nodes. And so we can actually use those to be able to apply the changes to the channel that we want. We have access to the channel already. We don't technically need access to the role, but it's fine that we do. The reason for that is we're not actually using the role. We just want to make sure that it exists. And we also have access to the action, so we know whether to add these permissions for this user for that channel or to remove the permissions for the user for the channel. So I'm going to add another comment here saying check if all permission nodes are valid. So before we actually go to apply permission nodes, we want to make sure that the user actually entered real information, a real permission node that is not going to be a random string that Discord doesn't know about. So I actually have something similar to this in a previous video for this series. So we're actually going to make some simple modifications to that. If you've been following the series, then you might have a commands folder for the previous advanced command handler. And if you haven't followed the series, feel free to look at the GitHub repository for the file that I'm about to make here so you can easily copy and paste that. This isn't something that you really need to type out. So under commands, we have our command base, and we see these valid permissions array right here, which has all the valid permissions that you'll find on the actual documentation. So I'm wanting to copy the array only. So starting at the opening curly brace and including it, going all the way down to the ending curly brace and including it, I'm going to copy this. And then inside of our utility folder, I'm going to make a new file. This one will be called permissions.js. Now the only thing this file is going to do is just export this. The reason why we're doing this is so we have one place where we have to manage permissions. We're going to be importing this inside of the file we just copied this from, and we're also going to be importing this inside of our update permissions file. And so we don't want to repeat ourselves or have duplicate code due to copy and pasting. So here, I'm going to simply say module.exports and set this equal to the array that I copied, and I can save this. And now we have to go into our command base file and actually import this. So this is called valid permissions. I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and then I'm going to go and delete this entire array. Now at this stage, above the actual function where that's being referenced, I'm going to import that. So I can say const valid permissions equals require, and I'm going to use something called a module alias. If you look here, I'm actually referencing certain folders that have alias names. These are obviously not the name of the folder, And if you don't have access to module aliases, you can use the relative path, which is what you would typically use to actually import something. But because I do have access to this, because I've set it up in a previous video, which will be linked in the video description, then I'm going to go ahead and use this system. So this is inside the utility folder, so I can do @util/permissions. And now we have access to permissions within this object right here, and this is going to be the actual array. And so this functionality didn't actually change. It's the exact same thing, but it's now more modular because we have moved the list of permission nodes into its own file. So we can save and close this. The functionality didn't change at all, but we can now import that file here as well. So going up to the top, I'm going to say const permissions, and set this equal to require the same exact path, so @util/permissions. So scrolling back down, we can now go through and make sure that every single argument within the arguments array is now part of that array that we specified in the file. So like I've previously mentioned, the only thing within the arguments array at this point is the permission nodes, so we can actually loop through that. So for const arg of args, and then we want to say if not permissions, which is the array that we imported right here on line 2, if not permissions.includes, which will return true or false depending on if something is included within the array. And we want to pass in arg, which is the current argument that we're looping through because of the for loop, .to uppercase. The reason for to uppercase here is because all of our permissions are in uppercase, as you can see right here. And so we want to convert the actual user input, which we can't control, into uppercase because that's what we have and we can control that. So we need to make sure that they are the same case sensitivity. So now at this point, this if statement is only true if the user typed in something that is not a valid permission. And so we're going to want to create a message that notifies them of all valid permissions and that something went wrong, and then we want to return. So before we forget, we can actually return right here, and then we can write in some code above it. So let's start off by creating a variable called allPerms, and this will be a message that contains all permissions. By default, this will just be an empty string. We can then loop through all of the valid permission nodes, so not the arguments, but the actual permissions we're importing from the file. So I can say for const perm of permissions. And then here I can say allPerms is plus equal to, so we're concatenating a string, a template literal. We're going to insert in perm, which is the current permission we're looping through for this nested for loop, and then a comma and a space. Now after that, I can say const error message, and then this is going to be a string. This will actually be a template literal. We can say unknown permission node, and we're going to add in quotes. We're going to insert in arg, which is the current argument that we're looping through. And so this is the one that has a problem. This is one that is not typed correctly. There's a typo. It's an unknown permission node, whatever it might be. It doesn't know about it. So unknown permission node with arg, and then we can say, please specify one of the following. And then because we're using template literals, we can add in new lines, and then we can insert in allPerms, and then we can say message.reply. Let me tab this in correctly again. So message.reply with error message. So we haven't actually changed the permissions yet within the code, but let's go ahead and try this to make sure that everything so far is working. I'm going to save this, and within my console, I'm going to run the bots with node index.js. Going back into Discord, we see that I have my tutorial channel right here. So if I run !update permissions, I can then test that, and it says you must provide a channel ID, role ID, all that stuff. So basically it understands that there's not enough information. So I can go and copy the channel ID, and let's say I want to give everyone access to reading the Discord community updates, which is just a private channel right now. I can right click and go to copy ID. And if you don't see this, you might have to enable developer mode within your Discord account. So right in here, we can paste this in, and then we want access to the role ID. So real quick, because we're going to be using this multiple times for testing, I'm going to go ahead and add a comment at the top of my file. This one will be called channel. And then we want to access the everyone role. And so we can do that by going back into Discord, clicking on your server and going to server settings, going to roles, and then right clicking on everyone and click on copy ID. So now we have access to the everyone ID. So now we can go in and add this right here. And then we need either an action, which is add or remove. So I can say add, and then I can say test because we're not actually going to update the permission nodes yet, but this should give us an error because test is not a valid permission. I'm going to go ahead and copy this command so I don't have to type it out again. Now when I run this, it says unknown permission node test, which is the invalid one. it says, please specify one of the following, and it has all of these. Now, if you notice, the end of this message ends with a comma, and it normally would end with a comma space, but Discord doesn't allow messages to end in a space because it's pointless. Now, the reason for this, if we go back and scroll down to where we're actually creating this message, we are adding a comma space to the end that's including the last one. So we actually want to remove the last 2 characters from this message. And that's very simple to do. After the for loop, so after it's gone through every single permission, at that point, there's a comma space at the end. We can then say allperms equals allperms.substring with 0 and as a start. So 0 is going to be the first index, and so that's going to be the very first character. And then the second argument is going to be word to end. In this case, we're going to say allperms.length -2 because there are 2 characters that we want to remove. Now, if I save this and I restart my bot, we can go back into Discord and I can run the command again, and we should no longer see the comma right there. So now what happens if I run this, and instead of add, I specify test. So if I run this, it'll say, please provide either add or remove as an action. Let's also test if I remove an 8 from the role ID. So now this should be an invalid role, and it says unknown role. Going back, I can also remove the last character from the channel ID, and this should say unknown channel. So all of our checks are working so far, and that means that if we make it to the point where we actually run this, we type in something that's valid, such as administrator. Now keep in mind this is a lowercase, but because we wrote the code to make everything uppercase, this won't be a problem. Now if I run this, nothing actually happens. It doesn't return with an error message, just simply nothing happens. The reason for that is all of our error messages are not being sent because there's no errors. We've actually ran the command correctly, we just haven't wrote the logic to actually update the channel permissions. So with that said, after the for loop, and I'm clicking on this curly brace right here so it highlights the end so I know exactly where to go. After this, I can add in a comment. This will say update the channel permissions. Now at this stage, we want to access the channel object, which we have defined on line 39. So I can say channel.overwrite permissions. This is a function that takes in an array as an argument, and this array is going to hold a number of different updates you want to perform. In this case, we only need one, and so we have the specified object here. We're going to have a couple different possible properties. We can have ID, we can have allow, and we can have deny. ID is there to specify the role you want to update for. So we can say ID is role ID, which we have gotten from the user previously. Now next, we want to specify either allow or deny, and we're going to do this in a way where both are present in this object, but they're only populated depending on if add or remove was specified within the command. So for example, allow is going to exist and deny is going to exist. So now we have to actually provide some meaningful value. It's just an empty array won't do anything. We want to use our arguments array, which has a list of permission nodes. So for allow, we first want to make sure that we're not allowing permission nodes that we're trying to deny. So we need to check to see if the action actually equals add. So to do that, we can use a ternary operator, which is basically saying action is exactly equal to add, and then we have a question mark, which is the actual ternary operator. And if this is the case, then we're going to say use args. If this is not the case, where action does not equal add, we are then going to specify the alternative or the default using a colon, and that's just going to be an empty object. We're going to do the same concept here for deny. So if action is exactly equal to deny, we're then going to use args. Otherwise, it's an empty object. Actually, this should be deny. This should be remove, because that's how we have our command set up. And now at this point, our channel has been updated. And after all of this, we want to confirm to the user that this has been done. So I can say message.reply, channel permissions updated. So I can save this, and we are going to restart the bot. Going back into Discord, I can then run the same command, but instead of giving everyone administrator access, which seems like a very bad idea, I'm going to give them view_channel access. Now, before I run this, if we take a look at Discord community right here, we see that there's a small lock on that. If I right click and go to edit channel and I go to permissions, we see that everyone cannot read this. Also scrolling down, we see that everyone is neutral on read files. So we are going to want to give them access to the read messages, which is basically the view channel permission node, as well as the attached files. So going back to Discord into the tutorial channel, I can say view channel space attach _ files. Now the reason why I know to type these exact things is because of the documentation. Right here, there's view channel, and there's also attached files. Now, if something isn't super self-explanatory, check the documentation. They do have some information in parentheses after each one that isn't super self-explanatory. So then we have those. I'm going to go ahead and run this command. It's going to say channel permission updated, but we also see this error that says bit field invalid, invalid bit field flag or number. The reason for that is that the arguments are still technically lowercase. So if I run this, but I make these uppercase, so for example, view underscore channel, and then attach underscore files. If I run this, we no longer get that error. This is from the previous error. More importantly, we see that this no longer has a lock on it. If I right click and go to edit channel, and I go to permissions, we see that read messages is now allowed for everyone, and that attach files is now allowed for everyone. I'm going to go ahead and manually undo those and save the changes. And the last thing we have to do, because of this error, is we have to actually convert all the arguments to uppercase. So there's an easy way to do that. We can actually convert our arguments array to a string, and then we can make that string uppercase, and then we can convert that arguments array back to an array. So we can say args equals args.join with a space. So at this point, our array, let's say that we have an example array of test and hello. This is now going to become the string test space hello. That space is there because of this option right here. Now after that, now that we have access to a string, I can say .to uppercase. And now our object is going to be test hello, just like this. And now we want to split this back into an array whenever there's a space. So we can say test and hello like this. So we can say .split with a space, as now our array of lowercase items has now been converted to uppercase. And actually we can improve our code a little bit, because up above, we're going to call to uppercase on every single one of these. We can actually get rid of this, and we can move this concept here above that for loop. So going up, I can paste it in right here. And now before we actually check to see if all the arguments are valid, they are being converted to uppercase beforehand. Now it's important that this is done after the action and all the other processing is done on the previous elements of the array, because again, Shift will remove those. So now at this point, we can go ahead and save this, and I can restart the bot. Going back, I can run the command that had the problem. So I'm going to edit this so I can easily copy and paste. And then I'm going to paste this in the channel. Before I run it, notice that the lock is still there because I manually changed them. If I run that, we get no error, and now the lock is gone. So confirming this, I can go to permissions. Everyone can read this channel, and everyone can attach files. So again, I'm going to manually remove those. But this is how you are going to update permissions for a specific channel using Discord.js. Thanks for watching this Discord.js tutorial. If you want to learn more about Discord.js, consider clicking on the playlist you see on your screen now. If you need help, feel free to leave a comment or ask in the Worn Off Keys Discord, which can be found in the video description.